This is the most painful rejection a dismissive avoidant feels. The painful rejection for a dismissive avoidant happens when you finally stop needing them. It is not simply losing your presence, attention, affection, or constant emotional availability anymore. It is realizing you no longer wait for their return, explanation, apology, or validation. For someone valuing emotional distance, your emotional independence can become surprisingly threatening and painful. They may believe you will always remain emotionally available whenever they eventually decide returning. They may expect your feelings to survive every period of silence and emotional withdrawal. But eventually, something changes inside you. And that change becomes impossible for them ignoring. You stop checking whether they viewed your messages, stories, posts, or online activity anymore. You stop wondering whether their silence secretly means they still care about you deeply. You stop interpreting every tiny signal as evidence that their feelings might eventually return. Most importantly, you stop organizing your emotional life around their unpredictable presence and absence. That is where the rejection becomes deeper than simply hearing those words, "I'm done." Because you are no longer rejecting their affection, you are rejecting their emotional control. You are saying through your actions that their distance no longer determines your stability. And that message can feel devastating to someone accustomed to maintaining emotional distance safely. A dismissive avoidant may feel safest when they control closeness, distance, timing, and emotional exposure. When you stop chasing them, that familiar control begins disappearing without dramatic confrontation whatsoever. Suddenly, they cannot predict when you will reach out, react, forgive, or return again. They may remember how easily you once responded whenever they offered even minimal attention. They may remember your patience, reassurance, and willingness to understand their emotional struggles deeply. They may remember conversations where you repeatedly asked for connection while they repeatedly withdrew. And eventually, they may realize that you are no longer asking those questions anymore. That realization can create an uncomfortable emptiness they never expected to experience after leaving. They might tell themselves that they wanted freedom, space, independence, and emotional simplicity instead. Yet freedom feels different when the person you distanced yourself from genuinely moves forward. Now, your silence communicates something their previous relationships may never have communicated so clearly. You are not waiting for them to become ready before continuing your life again. You are continuing without requiring their permission, reassurance, explanation, closure, or emotional participation anymore. That can challenge their deepest assumption about relationships, that distance protects them from vulnerability. Because your detachment proves something deeply uncomfortable, they can lose someone without controlling endings. They can create distance, but they cannot control whether you eventually stop caring completely. They can disappear, but they cannot guarantee you will remain emotionally frozen forever afterward. They can return, but they cannot guarantee you will still open your heart again. This is why your detachment can hurt more than anger ever could for them. Anger still communicates emotional investment, because anger says something inside you still matters deeply. Arguments can reassure an avoidant that the emotional connection still exists underneath everything else. But indifference communicates something much harder to reinterpret. The emotional attachment has finally weakened. When you no longer react, they may lose the feedback they unconsciously depended upon. Your silence becomes powerful because it contains no invitation for another emotional push-pull cycle. You are no longer participating in the familiar pattern of pursuit, withdrawal, and reconciliation. And without that pattern, they may finally notice what their distance actually cost them. They may remember your warmth differently once your warmth is no longer available to them. They may miss your presence intensely when they realize access is no longer automatic. They may wonder whether they misunderstood your patience, loyalty, kindness, and emotional investment before. They may even question whether they underestimated how deeply you genuinely cared about them. But there is an important distinction between missing someone and being ready for intimacy. Missing your presence does not automatically mean they understand why you had to leave. Feeling rejected does not automatically mean they have developed healthier emotional communication skills afterward. And wanting you back does not necessarily mean they can sustain a secure relationship. This distinction matters because your goal should never be making an avoidant person suffer. Your goal should be becoming emotionally secure enough that their behavior stops controlling you. The strongest rejection is therefore not revenge, punishment, jealousy, or deliberate cruelty toward them. The strongest rejection is peacefully choosing yourself after repeatedly feeling emotionally abandoned by someone. It is building a life where their attention becomes appreciated rather than desperately required. It is reaching a point where their return would no longer determine your worth. Imagine the moment they finally realize you have stopped waiting for their emotional availability. That moment may feel confusing because they once believed you would always remain accessible. But you changed, not necessarily because you stopped caring, but because you started healing. Healing changes the meaning of distance because you stop experiencing their absence as personal rejection. You begin understanding that someone else's emotional limitations do not define your desirability anymore. You recognize that love cannot survive through one person's patience and another person's avoidance. You realize that connection requires two people willing to communicate, compromise, and remain emotionally present. And once you understand that, returning to the old dynamic becomes difficult for you. This is the rejection a dismissive avoidant may never have expected from you before. You are not screaming, threatening, begging, competing, or trying desperately to prove anything anymore. You are simply unavailable for a relationship that repeatedly makes you question your emotional worth. That quiet decision can speak louder than hundreds of emotional conversations ever could before. Because this time, your silence is not manipulation. It is the consequence of clarity. Your distance is not punishment. It is protection for your emotional peace and dignity. Your independence is not designed to trigger jealousy. It is evidence of personal growth. And your moving forward is not an attempt to make them regret losing you. It is simply what happens when you finally understand that choosing yourself is necessary. Sometimes the person who fears closeness understands your value only after losing emotional access. But whether they recognize it or not, your healing remains valuable for your future. Do not measure your progress by whether the dismissive avoidant eventually comes back again. Measure it by whether their return would genuinely improve your life and emotional well-being. Because the deepest freedom comes when their presence feels optional rather than emotionally necessary. And that is when rejection stops being painful and becomes the beginning of emotional freedom.